opening the door. Where's the house? And she had more friends than to me. Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming during lunchtime. I hope you had a good breakfast. So, let me introduce myself. Many of you already know me. I'm Dennis Harper, a curator of collections and exhibitions here at the museum, and I am a candidate for the museum director and chief curator position, which the finalists are being interviewed this week. So first of all, I'd like to thank the hiring committee for inviting me to be a candidate. I'm truly honored, as I told the committee this morning in our breakfast meeting. To the others of you in the audience, again, thank you for coming. It's been my privilege to hold the position of curator here at the museum for nearly 11 years. I hope that I might have the chance to continue in a larger capacity to serve the museum, Auburn University, and the community, and to help guide this museum in this exciting new phase that we're just entering. For my presentation today, I thought I would talk about one of my curatorial projects that unfortunately failed to see the light of day, Raoul Haig in the Maverick Woods. Now I realize that normally a person in my position talking to you would probably try to play up their best successes. Nonetheless, I feel that this topic really addresses the sometimes contradictory roles that a museum director and a curator have to play. And those, in fact, are the dual positions of this newly defined museum director, chief curator. So I hope to convince you that I'm capable and willing to manage those separate responsibilities without conflict. So in 2012, JCSM acquired a sculpture by Raoul Haig, a gift of the Raoul Haig Foundation. Many of you should recognize the sculpture here. Untitled from 1975, sculpted in walnut. It's about 61 inches tall, not counting the pedestal. Haig was an artist whose career aligned with the abstract expressionists, both in time and place. And he shared many of their affinities in his art, although his work did distinguish itself and stand aside in various ways. In New York City, which was the epicenter of the abstract expressionist movement, he was very close friends with Willem de Kooning, Arshel Gorky, Mark Rothko, who incidentally were all immigrants like Haig. When he moved to Woodstock in upstate New York, his back door adjoining lot neighbor was Philip Guston, who at the time had also been working in abstract expressionism. I visited the late artist's home and his studio in the woods outside of the village of Woodstock, New York, in late fall 2011. I was going there to select the specific sculpture that we would take into our collection. And so my interest in putting together an exhibition really grew out of that very first experience on the sites, and especially expanded as I learned more about this, I call him an eccentric artist, and the voluminous body of work that he left behind. So as I conceived of it, the exhibition would accomplish two goals. First of all, I hope to position Haig's work within the context, our work, the work we received, within the context of his entire oeuvre, from the earliest pieces that I could find available up to his very final 3 pieces that he carved, and illustrate how he would fit in that larger stream of American modern art. But secondly, Haig had never had a monographic exhibition at a museum, except for one small showing at the Samuel Dorsky Museum of Art, which is in New Paltz, New York, not far from Woodstock, in 2003. So our exhibition and a publication would increase scholarship and awareness of an artist who was significant, but not widely known outside of a relatively small circle of specialists. Here is our artist later in life, mid-career, when he went back to visit areas that his family had moved to. a much happier Haig towards the end of his life, and an early picture of Haig on the left, wearing pseudo-military regalia. So let me introduce Mr. Haig to you. He was born Haig Hukalekian, that's H-A-I-G, I won't spell Hukalekian, in 1904 in Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. He was one of 6 children in a fairly modestly prosperous family. His father was a purchasing agent for providing goods to both private and civic and governmental offices and entities. The family was Armenian, living in Turkey at a time of ethnic turmoil and genocide. Armenians residing in Turkey at that time were under assault by both the Soviet Bolshevik forces and Turkish nationalists. Violence had erupted around 1915, and it continued to increase ever more throughout the decade. This forced the Hukalekians to seek refuge in Egypt. But young Haig, at age 16 or 17, was sent to America, where he would begin college in Ames, Iowa, of all places. He had attended a preparatory school in Constantinople called the Robert Academy, or the Robert College sometimes, which served the Christian minority in Turkey and also foreigners who were living under then the Ottoman Empire. So this academy, Robert Academy, had an affiliation with Ames and Iowa State University. So he left the family behind, came to America at a young age. Haig was not really very inclined towards the academic life. In fact, he was a little bit of a troublemaker and was reprimanded for ringing the bell in the tower at all hours and generally causing trouble. And as it turned out, Iowa State University was not a good fit for him in other ways. He referred to it later in life as, quote, a Quaker school, and complained that he couldn't take all the churches, revivals, and YMCAs that he found there. Before very long, Haig left Iowa State and headed to Chicago. There he found a crowd that was much more to his liking, as he called them later on, art students and other degenerates that he took up with. He found work at the Art Institute of Chicago, dusting sculptures for 50 cents an hour, and modeling for life classes. He also began taking classes there himself, drawing from plaster casts, and he later confessed that he just wasn't any good at it. He was terrible at drawing and, in fact, was told by his instructors that he should just give it up. But he didn't. While in Chicago, he met a young Italian woman named Maria. We don't know her last name, but Maria taught Haig how to dance the tango, and they performed as a dancing duo on vaudeville stages in Illinois and parts of Indiana. Now, the couple here, pictured large, is not Raul y Maria, but the Valentino-looking profile up in the upper right is a picture of Haig. Quite dashing, I think. Maria, however, felt like the name Haig Hukalekian just killed their act. So she gave him the stage name of Raul, which he kept for the remainder of his life. And in fact, here in his citizenship papers from 1930, it's signed Raul Haig. He changed the anglicized version of his first name from H-A-I-G to what we know now as H-A-G-U-A, and used it as his last name. He moved again. In 1925, he went to the major center of art in the United States, New York City, hitching rides east like a hobo on trains. And from 25 to 27, he had enrolled in the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design in New York, but found it rather like the Art Institute, a little bit more formal and academic than he really liked. So he switched over fairly quickly to become a member of the Art Students League and took classes there with William Zorach. Zorach's piece of sculpture on the right is in our collection, marble carving from 1927, torso with head. So this is the same time that he started taking classes at Art Institute, at the Art Students League. On the left is John Flanagan, and he took classes directly in Flanagan's studio, learning how to do direct carving. This is a work by Flanagan from 1931. Fairly quickly, Haig began to receive positive attention for his sculpture, and he was included in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932 called American Sources of Modern Art. His work had a little bit of an Aztec influence at the time, not quite figural or completely abstract, but also he was shown at the 1935 New York World's Fair exhibition called American Art Today. He worked as well under the auspices of the Federal Arts Project, the FAP, part of the WPA, from 1935 through 1939, and met Holger Kahle, who was the head of the program. Around the same time, he began to visit an artist studio up in Woodstock called the Maverick. Woodstock is about 100 miles north of the city in the Catskill Mountains. All of this was before the onset of World War II and Americans' involvement in it. But at Woodstock, he became very close friends with the founder, Hervey White. Hervey White's cabin, this is in a present-day photograph called Bear Camp, was one of several small rustic cabins that White had set up on the grounds of his colony, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Now, as I said, World War II interrupted all of his progress and, of course, the affairs of the world. Haig was drafted into the Army in 1941. White had such an admiration for Haig and his art that he offered to store his friend's sculpture for the duration of the war in his home, Bear Camp, here, until Haig was discharged. Haig served in the military for 2 years, but he didn't see active duty. He was assigned to a post in Colorado working at the donkey stables, which he said he truly loved. After his discharge in 1943, instead of coming back to New York City, because he had gotten accustomed to this life in the wilderness, he returned to Woodstock and bought Hervey White's cabin. Now, most people probably think of images like this when Woodstock is mentioned. However, Woodstock bohemian counterculture really dates back to the early 20th century, well before the psychedelic 60s. It dates really to about 1902, in fact, when Ralph Whitehead and Jane Bird McCall, who were attracted by the beauty of the Catskills around Woodstock, purchased 1,500 acres on the mountains to establish a utopian colony, which they named Birdcliff. There they built cabins and studios to accommodate a range of artists, craft workers, designers who came to spend time there year-round, although mostly in temperate weather. Some of its distinguished residents include Bolton Brown, Burge Harrison, Charles Rosen, John Carlson, Blanche Lazelle, and Dawson Watson. And I'm sure many of you regular visitors know many of those names from the collection that we have here. These are some typical, on the left, inhabitants during one of the galas that they often put on, both at Birdcliff and at the Maverick. And on the right is a hand-tinted photograph, undated, but probably in the teens or 20s, of Hervey White, dressed as Pan. So, 2 years after arriving at the colony at Birdcliff, Hervey was inspired to open his own colony on 100 acres that were nearby. Like Birdcliff, it attracted very many prominent visual artists, but in the beginning days, probably more colonists were musicians and writers. And they were a much more boisterous bunch than the Birdcliff inhabitants. They held an annual gala that probably could be compared to some of the 60s happenings, or maybe Burning Man, or raves in concert halls here for this generation. It was so rowdy that in 1931 they had to shut it down. But while it was going on, it was an adventure. Here's another photograph, an image of Harvey White inside his cabin at Bear Camp. And I put the photograph of Bear Camp next to it because you can see the three windows there where Harvey wrote, and he was really the big man on campus. Inspired a lot of people to come. So this painting actually is by Arnold Blanche, who was a writer, who was a painter who taught at Woodstock, who also opened up a colony in 1906. So some of the vestiges of this creative milieu are the extant concert hall that's in the dark photograph on the left. There's probably one of the few remaining vestiges of the wild festival that they ran every year. And Bird Cliff is known, as well as people at the Maverick, of this kind of arts and craft furniture design. So I show you these to give you an idea of the milieu that Haig was entering. It was not just some backwoods country setting where Haig settled in to work. It was vibrant, alive, and crazy. But despite that artistic milieu of Woodstock, Haig managed to lead a fairly isolated and even hermetic life up in the mountains. He transitioned from carving into small chunks of rigid stone that he did in New York, carrying them up 5 flights of stairs to get to his $25 a month studio, and instead expanded and began to work with available materials, which were the hardwoods that he collected from around the Catskills, and also big forked pieces of timber that were not usable at some of the lumber mills. He didn't get out much. He preferred to remain at this compound and make art. But over the years, as his reputation grew, folks were constantly visiting from the city, collectors, museum directors, even a young Bob Dylan stopped by, who Haig, in an interview with Smithsonian, later said chatted unintelligibly to him. He couldn't follow what he was even saying. In the end, he offered Haig his latest record, and Haig refused it. He said, you know, I don't like this folk music, he said. So we'll skip forward to that happy time in Woodstock to the present century, when I started to do research on this exhibition. So we had accessioned our gift of Haig's sculpture, and my investigations began in earnest. So that meant spending as much time as I could going through objects in the artist's archive, which were stored at a gallery in New York's Chelsea neighborhood. The archive had a trove of letters, photographs, notes, documents of every sort. So it was a great research that actually helped me to find some inconsistencies in the public record on him, such as MoMA had ascribed a different date of birth to him. Even the Haig Foundation had him attaining citizenship at a different year. But I was able to go through the primary documents and set that straight. Early vintage photographs by well-known photographers of the time, inventories that he had made in his hand, and so on. You know, there were a lot of catalogs of exhibitions that he was included in, and articles about him, including people such as Henry Geldzahler were writing about his work. There was a lot of material, boxes and boxes that were stored in the gallery's subfloor, in the basement, where other areas of chairs and furniture, some art, and the Haig archives were kept. Now, you may recall Well, here, I'll show this photograph too. He kept everything, including rejection letters when he didn't receive a grant. Also, when he did receive a grant, annotated by sometimes with condolences, but please try again. However, you might recall October 2012, there was a hurricane called Sandy that made its way up the eastern seaboard. And Hurricane Sandy's storm surge hit New York City in October of that year. It flooded streets, subways, underground tunnels, cellars, all across lower Manhattan, cutting power for days. So they couldn't even use sump pumps without generator to get rid of the flooding. These were some of the more legible pieces that were affected by the storm, but many other documents and letters, irreplaceable and undocumented otherwise, were eradicated or destroyed. So I had my hands full trying to decipher some of these and help deal with some of the damage. At the same time, I made return visits to Haig's home and studio in Woodstock, where very little had changed since the time he died. So I want to run through just a few photographs, both past and present. And sometimes it's really difficult to determine which ones were taken when he was in residence and when I went there in 2013. He was sort of a nut. He had clocks all over the house. He had photographs. He didn't draw, but he collected, made scrapbooks. He worked on large pieces of sculpture in his home, as you can see on the left side, when the weather was inclement. He used chainsaws, both large ones and small circular ones without a guard. He ended his life with all 10 fingers, so he was pretty good at it. Here are old and new photographs, and I would let you decide which one is which. It was rustic. I think he installed the electrical service to the cabin at some point. He didn't have a TV, but he did have a radio, and he loved listening to opera, not Bob Dylan. And I think these are the only two outlets within the entire cabin, which leads one to wonder how it survived these years without going down in smoke and fire. On his grounds, he had built a couple of storage units that are kind of like corn cribs, sheds that were out maybe 50 yards away from his home that really had changed very little to date as well. Some of the siding was replaced, but they were very simple. He had drawn up his plans on a chalkboard in his home and then built them himself. They consisted of not much more than a concrete slab floor, walls, a roof, a wide door that would allow passage of large pieces of sculpture, and a clerestory that went just under the soffit all the way around that would let light in because there wasn't electricity. No glass. Instead, he had quarter-inch welded wire mesh that was stapled to it just to keep the rodents, squirrels and bats and that kind of varmint out. By the time I visited, he had electrified the two buildings, but only for lights, not for climate control. Inside the units, all of his remaining sculpture was stored. Everything that hadn't gone during his lifetime or shortly after into a private collection or into museums. Shoulder to shoulder, up and down these passageways. It's like a curator's dream, and very hard to see and to make out what's what. There's really no organization to them. They were placed according to how they were placed at random. It was a lot of fun to go through. But of course, the difficulty with this exhibition that I wanted to put together, as with all exhibitions, is limiting the number that you can take. You want to craft a checklist that gives the program that you want to convey to examine his change in work from early times to the latest. Perhaps his change in technique, the change in scale, the way that he dealt with positive and negative space. But also, practically, what was it going to cost to move these things? Ours, at basically 5 feet tall, is one of the smaller sculptures. They're heavy, they're hardwoods. So they're not easy to move, they're not easy to pack. They cost money to bring from New York to Alabama. And also, I wanted to travel the exhibition. I had one other venue that was confirmed, and then I was trying to get an exhibition at Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State, because I thought it would be a nice return of the prodigal son. And of course, Iowa State has a great outdoor and indoor sculpture collection, so it made a lot of sense. I ended up going through them over several days and several visits, and chose 12 works, counting ours, because looking at installation photos from other venues in the galleries and elsewhere, they really need a lot of elbow room to be able to appreciate them. We would show them in our 2 largest galleries, and 12 seemed to be about the max I could fit in. I'll show you a few images in sequence here from that checklist. And these are the same work, just from different angles. The same here, left to right. The remarkable thing about Haig's work, like all sculpture, but especially it's significant with his non-representational art, is how much its aspect changes as you walk around a work of art. You'd think that they were 2 different pieces, or 3, or 4. So one of the things I wanted to do was to be able to give the viewers that chance to perambulate the works. But in the catalog, also reproduce them from 3 or 4 vantage points to try to get that across as well. Now, on my last visit to the studio, on the morning before I went to his warehouse, met with the foundation representative with whom I'd been working, and had a kind of disturbing bit of information given to me over a bagel. So this was around September, October of 2016, less than a year before we were to open the exhibition here in Auburn. There's some more pieces. I'm getting to that point, to this photograph. The representative told me that they had found a bug infestation on one of the works that I had planned to use in the exhibition. But not to worry. She said they had found no other sculptures that were affected. They consulted with a conservation company in Williamstown, Massachusetts, right across the state line, and they dealt with the issue according to the conservator's recommendations. They also did prophylactic treatment on all of the other works in that warehouse. And they were monitoring all of the works, as you see here, and you may have noticed from some of the previous photographs, this paper that's underneath each of these works. That's to see if any frass, as it's called, sawdust from burrowing beetles would fall. They hadn't seen any. There was just that one piece, which I would unfortunately have to replace. So she assured me that the treatment was effective and we were all good. The limited infestation was halted. They had been experiencing warmer winters over the past 2 or 3 years in Woodstock, and as I understand, agricultural experts call this a zone shift, not climate change, but a zone shift. So warm weather and bugs were making their way up the mountain, and they had never seen this kind of activity before in the decades since they had been there. There's one of those Woodstock winters. And it was one of the logistical considerations that I had to deal with. And it was the Catskill weather. Our exhibition was slated to open mid-August 2017. So well in advance of that time, we would need to photograph the works that we were including in the exhibition to put into our catalog, to reproduce them in the publication. Now, as you might guess from those photographs of the space, it was too tight there to bring in a camera and get some distance, or light equipment, or even the machinery to be able to lift the works to get seamless paper underneath them, to maneuver around them. Coincidentally, the museum had planned to close during May through August of that year as we underwent renovations to the Grand Gallery to accommodate some acoustic work, but also our vaults downstairs to update our fixtures to give us more space. So we were planning to do a demo within the space anyway. The exhibitions could not be held in the gallery, so we had climate-controlled space on site to move the entire collection upstairs. Now, I don't want to alarm you. The vaults ended up looking like this. So everything was nice, neat, orderly, and fantastic. But we did move everything upstairs while the renovations were going on. This occurrence also gave us the chance to receive the sculptures, put them in the vaults, and photograph them where we had room to maneuver. We couldn't bring them down earlier anyway because of the snow. There was severe weather, even with the climate change in Woodstock, with ice on the roads, with snowpack that needed to melt before the trucks could even get up to Haig's cabin. Haig's place was at the top of a narrow, winding dirt road, at the top of a paved curving road, at the top of a mountain pass. So impossible to get to. And even when everything was thawed, it was so inaccessible that they'd have to bring in a small truck, pack in these works one at a time, put them in a smaller truck, drive them down the hill to where a large transport truck was waiting, and load them in one at a time. This could occur in April. So it was a tight schedule, but it was doable. So they did the packing, and this was the way that the Haig Foundation had packed their works previously. It was cost-effective, it was safe for the works, and it was relatively low cost. The works were packed in packing blankets, like you might see, moving blankets, wrapped in shrinky plastic, palletized so we could move them with pallet jacks or bigger equipment, and loaded up onto a truck, geared very solidly to the floor, and transported down here. So they arrived. We began to unpack them within a couple of days to acclimatize, and then set up our makeshift photo studio. We started doing high-quality photographs where we could give them the due that they had never had before. Despite some beautiful lighting on other photographs, they were cramped because of the space they had to be shown, or they were photographed in a gallery. And then trouble hit. Upon unpacking one of the sculptures, we found sawdust in small spots on one of the packing blankets, frass. So it was evidence either of an old infestation, the dust might have gotten disjarred on the trip down, or a current one. The next day, we started to see a few small winged beetles that were in the gallery around the sculpture where we observed the frass. So our worst fear, that these dormant bugs would awaken once they arrived at the beautiful Alabama springtime after a cold northern hibernation. And it had come to fruition. So we immediately sprung into action. We resealed the affected work that we saw and removed it to the loading dock downstairs, ensuring that it was extra well sealed in plastic, including overwrapping and taping it to the floor in case any were somehow able to escape. We began re-examining all the other works that were in the exhibition, the ones that had been opened and the ones that were still wrapped in plastic, because our utmost concern was the fact that these infested objects were in the galleries where our entire art collection was stored temporarily for the summer. Wood-boring insects. Here's one, if you can spot that little spot on the end grain. A close-up, they're quite small, barely 1/8 of an inch in length. They can fly short distances. We also contacted an entomologist at Auburn University to come examine the creatures that had arrived along with the art. Retired Professor Gary Mullen and his colleague, Charles Ray, identified this as the Eastern Death Watch beetle, a new name for me. It was so named centuries earlier in really a kind of a spooky, Gothic, poetic manner due to its mating behavior. Observers would note often a kind of steady tapping that emanated from wooden furniture in otherwise silenced rooms where elderly and sick lay in their beds, awaiting release from their mortal coil. Or in more prosaic terms, the male beetles tapped the burrows inside where they were waiting to attract a mate, hence to renew a cycle of egg to larva to pupa to adult. And damage by these creatures could be devastating. These are not the sculptures, but these are pieces of wood elsewhere. In England, it's not just limited to the United States and to the eastern region. In England, the bugs can grow quite large, in fact. Some images again of our bugs, and we began to see the numbers increase from the one on the left to many more on the right. Okay, so we found evidence inside another one as well and removed it just as fast from the gallery level. As you can expect, I had been in a similar flurry of conversations with the foundation representative and among select museum staff. I won't go into all the details of what we discussed, but every possible scenario, I think, we worked our way through, including loading everything, which Danielle would have preferred, immediately onto a truck and getting them as far away as possible from the museum. But also the idea that we might find a place to set up a mobile fumigation center and deal with the furniture, deal with the sculpture, and then postpone the exhibition. And many other options. And so it's at this point, really, that I had to step outside of my role as exhibition curator and look at a larger perspective. And some of that kind of dual conflicting roles that I mentioned at the outset of my talk. So despite my emotional attachment, the time attachment, my hope for this exhibition, I really had to make the decision to cancel the exhibition. The risk of our collection was just too great. So we had two confirmed objects there that were experiencing serious infestations. That could have been all of them. We don't know. The others could have followed suit. We continue to monitor all the galleries and up and down the museum many times a day. In fact, I still watch to make certain there are no bugs. We rewrapped everything tightly, double sealed in plastic, and quarantined them into another room, the door to which we sealed with plastic and put in a zipper entryway, access door, to keep them there until the truck would arrive to take them back to Woodstock, where they planned a major remediation of not only these, but the rest of the works of art. Here's some of the work that we had of the two that were affected downstairs. Here they are, packed up into a smaller truck than they arrived in, but there was enough room to position everything safely in the truck and drive it back to Woodstock. It was a saddening and abrupt ending to an ambitious and worthy project. On the bright side, with very little warning to our staff, we were presented with a real-time test of our emergency preparedness. I have to stretch for the bright side, but that's very true. And I'm glad to say that we passed that test with flying colors. I was very proud of our registrar, Danielle Funderburg, curatorial assistant, Jessica Hayes, the preparators that we had on staff at the time, and even a student assistant who came together with me to discuss all the options, to analyze what we had to do, and to deal with the problems, which we did in a very efficient manner and without panic. Our director, Marilyn Laufer, was supportive in every way, and in the end, she allowed me, thank you, Marilyn, to make that anguishing decision to cancel the show. But it's a decision that I don't regret. A quick coda to that story. Obviously, we needed to have an exhibition installed for our grand reopening at the end of the summer. All the renovation was complete, and people had been denied access to the museum. So here's one example of how building a great permanent collection of art can pay off. I was able to put together over the next several weeks an exhibition that was assembled entirely from the permanent collection, and it was perfectly appropriate to one of the reasons that we had to close. Space. It revolved around space. A lack of space. Appropriate space. Making efficient use of space. So why not sculpture? So this exhibition dealt not only with conventional sculpture, and I was able to include our Hague in there as a little condolence to him, but also works of art that dealt with sculpture in various ways, with the idea of three-dimensional space, from digital impressions of space to painterly recreations of space, photography that dealt with space, exploiting or denying, maybe blurring the distinction between 2D and 3D physicality. I call the exhibition height times width times depth, which is, of course, the convention we use for measuring three-dimensional reality. And it turned out to be a good exhibition. So, to conclude, I think I'm right on time, I hope that, first of all, this talk may have given you some insight into what a curator does, how we work, our enthusiasm for the research and discovery, and the roadblocks, sometimes huge, that they or we face when we bring you the exhibitions that you enjoy and learn from in museums and galleries. Moreover, I hope that it was able to provide a little bit of that context to our Sculpture by Hague that I had intended to serve up with that ill-fated exhibition. I take my role as JCSM's curator very seriously as I work to fulfill the museum's mission to preserve, enhance, research, and interpret the collections that have been entrusted to us. And I truly hope that my efforts in that vein are not constrained to some kind of academic silo. I feel that my charge is to serve the public, to share art's intrinsic value with our many and varied audiences. Art has a way of opening one's eyes to deeper perceptions of the world. Sometimes a viewer just needs the opportunity and a little encouragement, which we provide here at the museum. Like a curator, a museum director must have that same dedication to the museum's mission, paired with a vision for the institution's future. She or he has to face unwelcome decisions from time to time, every day, in fact, and find ways to clear the inevitable obstacles to realizing that vision. A good director leads by strong example, yet must step back to allow others to achieve their own best work. I hope that you might find those qualities present in my candidacy for this position, and I thank you for this consideration. So we may, thank you. We may have a few minutes in case any of you would like a question posed to me personally about the position or about Hague Hookalikian. So I'd open it up just in case. Yes, David.
Thank you for keeping the death watch beetle out of the bowl.
Yes, absolutely.
Earlier this month, the 4 candidates for the library dean position gave PowerPoint presentations about where they thought the collection, in that case, books and
Yeah.
are at Auburn, and whether they thought the collection was strong, where it was weak. Obviously, any collection can't include everything, so what should be goals and priorities in terms of integrating collection with would you like to share with us, and since you're an know this, where you would like to see if you become the
So, you know, we have collections, we have exhibitions, and we have all kinds of educational programs and educational opportunities for students that we present here. In terms of the collection, clearly, and this is what I've been trying to do in my 10 years here, is to build upon our strengths. Mid-20th century American modernism is one of the main ones, but we have other areas. I'm also trying to expand our collections into new areas in ways that benefit the university curriculum, and also our larger audiences outside of the university. We're not going to be the Metropolitan Museum and have that kind of broadly Catholic encyclopedic collection. But I think it's very crucial for anyone, students or lifelong learners, to experience art in the flesh, from the real object, to understand what these artists, this movement, this material is all about. You don't get that from a digital reproduction, no matter how good, or from reading a great description, poetically or scientifically. You have to experience it firsthand. So we've been adding, not the Mona Lisa to our collection, but we've been adding Italian works from, let's say, 15th, 16th, 17th century, so students can experience actual works of art from that period and gain insight into what the artist was doing. So expanding into new directions, some of those include Asian art, African art, obviously we've been working on photography lately, historic, from early periods up to contemporary practice, because we are an educational institution that's connected with the university. So this is part of our role, to provide a resource there. The programming, I think, corresponds with our exhibitions and our collections, obviously, but it needs to expand in other areas to help people understand and appreciate, comprehend art in general, not just the visual arts and not just the conventional media. So they are a correlation to what we do with our programming. Education, I think it's very important that we deal with the youngest to the oldest students. And not really, as I was mentioning in a meeting just before this, not just to build future audiences or future donors for this museum, but I think it's incumbent upon us to educate the population in critical thinking, in writing, and seeing the world, an appreciation of art, a description of art, a confrontation with art in some way helps to do that, and for the betterment of our society and our culture, not to sound too altruistic, but I think it's important for us to do that. Our major focus is university students and assisting faculty and staff as well in teaching what we do, not only about the subject of art, related subjects, and also, which we've only begun to do, teaching about the profession of presenting and interpreting art. I think it's important that we try to build, and we're working on this, it's slow to develop, but a museum studies program. Internships at the museum. We want to build those. Everything takes money, everything takes time, resources of space, and everything else. So a museum director and the museum at large and the district, as well as a larger university, needs to look at all those options and have a dialogue, have a discussion, not a dialogue, but a broad discussion of what is the most important thing that we can do with our resources in this time and in this place. And it's a consensus that we would build. So, you know, it takes money to build a wing, it takes money to set up scholarships for internships or for new positions. So the director would obviously have a say, an important say in how that transpires and what decisions are made, but the community as well. And so all of our communities, we want to hear from every one of you. And our development officers would like to hear from every one of you as well to help fund those. So, David, I'm not certain if that touched on the crux of your question, but I think, you know, I would, as curator, as the only visual arts dedicated curator here, you know, we all deal with exhibitions and collections as a small institution, but as my focus on that, I've been involved with those issues for, as I say, almost 11 years. And I do have to wear other hats as well. I work with development, I work with education, I work with preparators, I work with the board of advisors, and I've had experience in helping to lead the direction that we have come, and you know, we have further paths to follow, and now with the alliance of our partner across the street, there are some great opportunities to be had. And I know you'll be hearing more about those in the coming days, weeks, months, and you'll witness them about a year from now. So, any other questions? Yes? Well, thank you. And, you know, and I think it was really the only thing to do. There is a chance that those were the only two in the entire sheds of those dozens of sculptures that had been affected, plus the other previous one, but we don't know that. The life cycle of this insect is long. And in fact, I've been asked, are we going to restage the exhibition anytime soon? Under certain circumstances, I would. These works have to be dealt with in a complete way. Fumigation is one way. It may not be completely effective. Heat treatment is another. You bring all of the works in a chamber up to a certain level of heat just below burning them, which kills the bugs deep inside of the furthest burrow they make. But that does dry out the wood. You have to try to maintain high levels or the regular levels of humidity while the heat is being applied to it. There are instances with forest fires in the woods where intense heat has killed, has deforested the hillside, but they found bugs living still in the very core of the wood. So it's not completely effective. After treatment, these would need to be taken out of their housing where they were in Woodstock and placed into a hermetically sealed, climate-controlled interior space. And I would insist, and I think we all now know more than we did then, but I would insist on 7 to 10 years quarantine to make certain that there weren't some sleepers in there that didn't come out. So, you know, we dodged a bullet, but we jumped on it very quickly at the very first instance that we noticed it. And like I say, it was a disappointment, but it was also a success. It showed the professionalism of the staff, you know, everybody that was involved. So, and, you know, I think if I had said to Marilyn, no, let's go ahead and hold the exhibition, she might have vetoed that, and I think any good museum director would have. So I had some backup, but it was excruciating to say bye. But that's what happens. Okay, anything else? Well, I think I've run out of time, but maybe one quick question, Chris? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. And besides the informal ways of, you know, one-to-one or conversations, I'd rather institute different policies than what we've been doing in the past. One of those is actually coming to the selection of the exhibitions that we put forward here. You know, we have limited space, we have limited resources. We can't do everything that we would like to, either of exhibitions that we organize internally or that we host, or guest curators propose to us. But I would like to actually create a larger committee to review the proposals that we get in a systematic way, to get input from people within the museum in different departments and people outside of the museum in the university, to get feedback. And I get a lot of proposals. I mean, every week, my inbox, either in snail mail or by email, has another proposal. I and Marilyn have essentially worked independently, but drawing in opinions from other people on staff, our board of advisors and elsewhere, but it hasn't been a formulaic way of doing that. I'd like to systematize this and get some process that we would go through. And I think that would help. But also I think, you know, somehow with our evaluations of visitors, not with every program we put out, in every way that we can get the information out saying that we would like to hear from faculty in Department of Art and Art History, but also elsewhere in the university, and our colleagues in the area and other disciplines as well. You know, we'll have to disappoint some people that we can't do what is probably a very compelling and meaningful exhibition because we have 6 spaces. So, but I do want to find ways and also listen to ways from you and others about how we might get that input. And whether I'm the director or whether I remain curator of collections and exhibitions, this is something that I would want to bring up with our new director to see how we can make this, well, more professional, I guess. We've done well in the past, and I think we've done some good exhibitions, but I think we're in a position now that we're growing, not only with the involvement with the Gouge Center as a unified arts district, but just here at the museum. You know, we've passed the 10-year milestone, 15 years. We're no longer a young museum, and we're changing, and we're finding ways to be more efficient, more effective, and more responsive. And I think, you know, it's being open to those discussions and encouraging input from everyone else. So perhaps that kind of approached it. I'm getting a gesture from the back of the room. So once again, I thank you all for coming. I thank the hiring committee for inviting me here. And I hope whatever happens after the end of the week that the museum finds the best director possible. Thank you.